Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Every so often, a question comes along that reshape how we understand innovation itself. Why do some ideas take off and change the world, while others, just as promising, quietly disappear? To explore that question, we are joined by today someone who has dedicated his work to uncovering the answer. It is a privilege to welcome Dr. Michaël Bikard, Associate Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, to Business Talk. Professor Bikard's research invites us to look beyond the brilliance of ideas and instead examine the moment in which they emerge, the timing, the context, and the environment that ultimately determine their fate. One of his most fascinating contributions is the concept of idea twins, where multiple teams independently arrive at the same idea at nearly the same time, yet see entirely different outcomes. Through his lens, his work reveals a powerful truth. Success is not just about having the right idea, but about where and when that idea takes shape. His scholarship has appeared in some of the world's leading journals, including Administrative Science Quarterly, Management Science, Strategic Management Journal, and Organization Science. Along the way, his work has earned numerous recognitions from the Kaufman Dissertation Fellowship to the NSF Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant, as well as top honors at the MIT Sloan Doctoral Research Forum. Before joining INSEAD, he was a part of the faculty at London Business School, and he completed his PhD at MIT Sloan, specializing in technology innovation, entrepreneurship, and strategic management. Today on Business Talk, Professor Michaël shares insights from his research on gender inequality and the technological impact of scientific ideas, work that challenges us to rethink whose ideas shape the future and why. So without further delay, let's begin. Professor Michaël, it's a true privilege to have you on Business Talk. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, your paper starts from a simple but powerful idea that inventors should, in principle, want to stand on the tallest shoulders. When did you first realize that those giants might be disproportionately male, and what sparked this specific research journey?
Yeah, I've been interested in innovation for a long time. For me, innovation is creating the future. And so it's hard for me to think of a more important question to do research on than what is the future we're trying to build here and who is building it. And so that has been my agenda since at least my PhD, if not earlier. Now, the question of gender came partly serendipitously from talking to my colleague at London Business School, Isabel Fernandez-Mateo, who I think you had on this podcast as well. And she mentioned, so she's very famous about for her work on gender inequality. My home is innovation. I'm primarily an innovation researcher. But it felt like we needed to work together to try to unpack what role gender inequality might be playing in innovation in particular, but more broadly in the type of future we're creating.
Professor combined three very different approaches: big data analysis of over 10 million papers, paper twins, and an experiment with 400 PhDs. If you had to narrate this project as a detective story, what were the key clues each method revealed about gender and technological impact?
And so the first question was, wouldn't it be interesting to check if different things happen when men and women have the same idea? I had done work on idea twins before, and that was a big part of my dissertation, but I hadn't been looking at gender. So the idea was the first conversation was, okay, let's just look at cases where men and women have the same idea at the same time, and let's see what happens to the idea depending on whether they came from a man or a woman. So that was the point of departure. And we saw that the idea had a lot more impact when it came from men. at least as measured through patent to paper citations, which is more broadly a measure of how much attention those ideas are getting among inventors. So that was the first discovery moment. But of course, we're just looking at a small setting of cases where men and women had the same discovery. It's a small sample. We had very quickly this question as part of the review process, but also that it's a legitimate concern that how broadly applicable this insight is. And so we had this amazing PhD student that we brought on board, Ronak Mogra, who is doing his PhD. He's from India as well, and he's doing his PhD at INSEAD. And so that he led an effort to collect this massive data set of 60 million publications. Eventually, we narrowed the analysis on the over 10, 15 million that we had the best information on. And we could see that the gender gap is indeed very broad. It happens in every field. I was shocked by this finding. And it's not just in these twins, it's in every field there is a gender gap. Even in fields where gender inequality seem to be less prevalent, like say in sociology or in psychology, where it's just more women. But we find that this gap is extremely widespread, and it does not decrease over time. It's something that seems to be very sticky. So that was the study number 2, I suppose. And then the study number 3, which was the survey of people who held PhDs or doctorates. Some of them were MDs as well. And when in that study, we asked people to assess the quality of an idea described by a title and an abstract. And we randomly manipulated the first name of the principal investigator. The last name was the same, it was always Anderson. But some people saw Richard or David, and other people saw Elizabeth or Sarah. And we found that when the first name was female, people just paid less attention to the abstract and thought it was in general less important. That was a big shock. And so that was, if you want, the third aha moment. So this paper brings in 3 type of eureka moment, if you want. But to be fair, this project took a very long time.
Professor, the paper twins design where men and women independently publish essentially the same discovery is a striking methodological idea. Why is this design particularly useful for studying gender inequality, and what did it reveal?
Yeah, it's very useful because it's very easy to compare men and women's success in general, in innovation, for instance, but in every area. The problem is that when we observe, say, that men get a lot more attention or a lot more credit than women do, we never know if that's because there is some kind of bias in the allocation of credit or attention, or if women work on projects or have ideas that are just different. You could imagine a world where inventors just pay less attention to women just because women do have ideas that are perhaps more fundamental than men's ideas, or perhaps of lower quality. And so we call this an identification challenge, right? It's very hard to assess what is driving the outcome, which is the gap in attention. And so the idea of looking at these idea twins allow us to keep the idea constant, and therefore we know that whatever gap we observe is actually not driven by the idea, but is driven by the context around the idea.
Professor, one of your central findings is that women's papers receive fewer patent citations even after controlling for quality, journal, and field, and that the gap is even larger in the twin sample. How did this result change the way you personally think about meritocracy in science-based innovation?
That is a very vast topic. I certainly think that this paper has a lot of angles to it in terms of what we should be taking away from it. And one of it is about, frankly, meritocracy, if you want, or just inequality, or just fairness. Yeah, it looks like at least our data is telling us that women just get less for the same ideas that a man would have with that idea, and that's just unfair. And so you can absolutely look at it in terms of fairness and say, well, don't we want science to be more meritocratic? If we do, then what we found in this paper, what we document in our paper, should be a little bit of a alarm call. There are, of course, other ways to look at our findings. If you are not someone who cares very much about fairness and inequality, if you just care about the space of innovation, like if you want innovation to be faster and people to have more better ideas and technology to advance at a faster rate, then that's also bad news, right? We should want as few frictions as possible in the choice of project of which ideas end up being successful or not. We should want the better ideas to succeed and the worst ideas to fail. Well, our paper is showing a friction in this process of selection of ideas that leads worse ideas to succeed, presumably, and really good ideas to essentially be left hanging on the table or in an academic lab. And then, of course, there's a third dimension, which is about what gets discovered. To the extent that men and women work on different things, we know that people tend to solve their own problems. You know, for instance, in healthcare, men are more likely to work on men's diseases than women are, and vice versa, right? And so you can easily imagine that to the extent that we don't pay attention to women's ideas, then we're not gonna find a cure to diseases affecting women at the same rate as we find cures for diseases affecting men, which again goes back to fairness and also, frankly, the type of future we're building. It's a future built by men for men, and I think there's an open question: is that really optimal? And my argument would be it's not.
Professor, you carefully distinguish between supply-side explanations like networks, resources, institutional prestige, and demand-side explanations like attention and evolution. What surprised you most when you saw that differences in style, resources, and networks could not fully account for the gap?
What surprised me most was, frankly, that most of the supply-side explanations that have been well documented in prior studies, we did not find any evidence for them. Now, that doesn't mean they were not that they don't exist. It's just that in our data of twins, we find no statistically significant relationship between network and patent to paper citations or resources. Or now you can find issues with our measures, but that's just a non-finding that was a shock to me, and which made me feel that like the gap that we're identifying, at least within our twin sample, was actually coming from the demand side. And I suppose the online experiment we ran confirmed this. Now, it doesn't mean that in practice, the supply side mechanisms do not occur in the wild, right? Like that networks don't matter or that like resources don't matter. I strongly believe they do. It just happens that in our twin data, we could not see those playing out.
Professor, in the online experiment, simply changing the author's first name altered how long participants read the abstract and how important they thought the discovery was. What does this tell us about the subtle, often unconscious ways in which gender status beliefs seep into scientific judgment?
We were frankly shocked by this finding. I must say, we did this mostly because the reviewers asked us to, and we try to be thorough in answering reviewers. I remember trying to think about how I would explain that we don't find anything. That was my state of mind when we run this experiment. Was okay, we have to run it because our reviewers is asking to do it. How are we going to explain the fact that there is nothing in the data? I was so shocked when we saw this difference. Now, how do I make sense of it? Well, I think there is. I think I had to go back to my PhD days actually, and I think as a PhD students, I had this experience that I think many PhD students have, which is um, you are in a seminar, you have some kind of comment that you think is smart or not, and no one notices. Just like everybody moves on, like it's like you didn't speak, and then just like 1 or 2 minutes later, someone very famous said the exact same things, and everybody is reacting like, "Wow, this is such an amazing idea," etc. And it's very depressing. But that's certainly the feeling that I have felt, and I have since heard a lot of women say that this is their lives. So it does feel like, I think for men who are the beneficiary of the effect that we're documenting, it's harder to wrap their mind around it because they don't experience it as much as women do. But I think that's where I think going back to maybe when you were young, before you had the status that you do, how it is that you felt, because that might help you understand how women feel.
Professor, your analysis suggests that industry inventors, in particular, are less likely to draw on women-led work than on men-led work. What might be happening inside firms, whether in such processes, technology, scouting, or culture, that amplifies this demand-side bias?
So our theory is not necessarily that anything specific is happening inside firms. It's more that people use gender as a cue to evaluate ideas when they don't have anything better to go by. If you know the person, then you're a lot less likely to use gender as a cue. And so, since in our data, we're looking at idea twins where both of the scientists making the discovery are in academia, then you expect the inventors in academia to just know those people. And so for them, the gender doesn't really matter. They're going to pay attention to the people depending on other proxies. But for people, inventors in industry, they don't know those people. They don't know who they are. They don't know how good they are. And so that's where we expected gender to matter more, and that's what we found.
Professor, you point out that women scientists are more likely to work on problems that disproportionately affect women, and that under-reliance on their work may mean thousands of female-focused inventions are missing. Can you give us a concrete example of how this bias might translate into real-world technological neglect?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that earlier. To the extent that women tend to solve their own problems and men tend to solve their own problems, then our findings suggest that the bias we're documenting is likely to further lead us to live in a world created by men for men, where women's problems are not getting solved at the rate that they could.
Professor, if you were advising a large R&D intensive company that genuinely wants to avoid leaving valuable ideas on the table, what 2 or 3 practical changes would you urge them to make in how they scan, evaluate, and integrate academic science?
This is pushing the data further than it goes. What we are doing in this paper is really documenting a gender gap in attention to scientific ideas among inventors. We are not testing any solution for that problem. We're just showing, hey guys, we have a problem here. In a way, I would often like to say this is the most depressing paper I have ever worked on. It's depressing because the effect is there. It's bad news, and it's very robust, and it's everywhere we looked. So I want to be clear. The paper stops at documenting the problem. It does not help us come up with solution. Now, that said, based on our understanding of the nature of the problem, there are at least two solutions that come to mind. The first one, I think, is education. If you can teach people, tell people about this bias that they probably have. An important thing that we saw in our experiment in particular is that the bias toward thinking that women's idea, paying less attention to women's ideas, or thinking it's less important, that is true for both male and female respondents. So this is a very widespread bias potentially that we all have, and it's human, it's normal, it makes sense that we would have. We would try to find any cues we can to assess the value of ideas, and we just like lock in gender as a cue. It's understandable, but it's a problem. So the first thing is education. Let people know that they might have this bias, and so let them make the effort to try to overcorrect. That means if a woman in a seminar is just presenting an idea, just force yourself to pay more attention than you would otherwise do, because to counteract this bias that everyone is likely to have. So that's number one. Number two, I think there might be institutional potential responses to this. Right? In academia, we have an institution called a review process, which is anonymous, and we have like 3 people that don't know who the authors are to assess a paper without knowing, right? No one knows who the other person is. It's double blind in our field. So you can see how that would avoid this kind of bias. Now, it's a pretty heavy and expensive type of institution, but you can see how that would solve the problem. Now, somewhere between education and creating an institution where possible feels like the right direction, based on what would the effect we document.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Finally, stepping back from this particular paper, how does this research connect to your broader agenda on why some promising ideas and technologies take off while others do not? And what are the next big questions you are working on?
So I'm very interested into understanding the impact of the context or the time on whether ideas succeed or not. You can think of it as a zeitgeist, right? Like what it means that an idea is ripe for a time or not. That's why I study independent discoveries. This is the core of my research and the core of my teaching. And so the friction at the level of the gender of the discoverer is just one of many potential things that might make like ideas to succeed or not at specific times. So a lot of what I'm doing research on these days is trying to understand the dynamic of the context, what I call the moment for an innovation. When did that emerge? When did that disappear? And how can people take advantage of people and firms take advantage of those dynamics to increase their performance and to get more out of their innovation effort. At the end of the day, my North Star as an academic is I think of as opening up the frontier to more and more people, helping people be at the frontier to be successful. And so I think understanding the impact of the context and the impact of the time on the opening of opportunities is an essential part of getting people to the frontier. So that's what I'm focusing on.
Thank you, Professor Michaël, for sharing such thoughtful insights on how gender inequality shapes the technological impact of scientific ideas. Your work not only deepens our understanding of innovation, but also reminds us whose idea we choose to build on where we design the future. It has been a privilege to host you on Business Talk, and I'm sure our listeners will carry these reflections into their own research, practice, and leadership. Thank you once again, Professor Michaël Bikard, for joining us today.
Thank you.